Welcome everyone to today's webcast. Sorry we got started a little late today, and we want to make sure that we've got everything working here. Let me just go ahead and minimize this real quick. Sorry about the delay for you guys here. There we go. Perfect. Now we're all set to start. Apologize for that. I had a little bit of dialing in issues there, but let's go ahead and get started. I'm Nick Cavalancia, your host today with Tech Evangelism. I'm a Microsoft Cloud and Data Center MVP with over 25 years of enterprise IT experience. I'm also joined today by Travis Evans with Offsite Data Sync. Travis is a sales engineer with Offsite Data Sync. He's been working in cloud-related IT for over 6 years, specializing in virtualization and data protection. Travis, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, Nick, happy to be here. Thanks for having me, and looking forward to the webinar.
As am I. Finally got this thing working, and I'm glad we can go ahead and get started. So for those of you in the audience today, it's a little bit of a different format. Rather than us having death by PowerPoint, we've got 158 slides to show you in a matter of mere minutes. Instead, I think there's about 5 or 6 slides in total, and Travis and I instead are going to have a discussion around the topic of the role of DR planning and testing. Now, we want to make sure that you get a chance to engage with us in this conversation, so by all means use the Q&A box, put in some comments, questions, anecdotes, thoughts, whatever you happen to have, stick those in there, and we'll make sure that we can actually include you in on the conversation. So as part of this, since we have such a small number of slides that are going on, if you don't see the slides advancing, like for example right now you're just seeing the title slide for the entire webcast, nothing's moved forward just yet. If you don't see the slides moving forward, that's okay. I want you to think of these slides as being more a visual indicator of where we're at in the presentation rather than it being the sole focus, or rather you just kind of sit back, relax, listen to us talk. If you feel like you have something to add, please use the Q&A box and interact with us during the webcast today. We, of course, will have formal Q&A at the end of today's webcast as well. So the place we're going to start is just talking about, we have 3 issues we want to talk about here. Are you DR ready? And we also want to talk about the process of building a DR plan, and then we want to talk about the critical role of testing. And that's really the 3 cruxes of the issues today. So when we talk about are you DR ready, there's really no doubt, I think most of you are keenly aware that the issue of being disaster ready and having a disaster recovery plan is really a question of when and not a question of if. You know what's going to happen. I've actually got a slide here in a moment. I'm going to show you a quick graph here that kind of indicates some of the different issues that organizations are having. And as operational risk is increasing because of issues, as a matter of fact, I'm just going to show all these. There we go. If you look at the different types of outages that happen on the right-hand side, these kinds of different issues, whether it's natural disasters or IT failure, you see floods, power outages, even fires, all the way down at the bottom to things like epidemics and pandemics, these are all adding to operational risk. And they come in various forms, which means when you're thinking about it from a disaster recovery perspective, there are different ways to respond to each of these disasters. And so with this operational risk increasing, with these various types of disasters, the necessity for a DR plan of some kind becomes kind of imperative. It's paramount. You must absolutely have a plan, if not multiple plans, if you will, depending on what the response should be for a given kind of, I'm doing air quotes here, disaster. And think about from that perspective, you've got to have a plan, and then also you've got to make sure that you've tested that plan just to ensure some measure of success. A plan that's not tested isn't worth anything more than the paper that it's on, if even that. So just to kind of start the conversation, Travis, maybe we can begin with some of the questions of sort of how often you're seeing customers having true DR plans in place and if they're actually DR ready.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Tennessee, kind of out in the wild, seems to line up with a recent study I read probably a few months back, maybe middle of the year or so. In that study, they said that 3 out of 4 companies do not have a DR plan. And even of those 25% that do, another 75% of them don't test it or never test it. They maybe developed a plan, but then, that may have been 1, 2, 3, 4 more years ago, and they probably couldn't tell you what was in it. And, let alone the time that they actually practiced and kind of ran a DR drill or a test and, actually verified that it's still a valid plan.
Yeah, in some ways, that's not surprising and surprising all at the same time. I hear those stats. I want to see that, by the way. So maybe after this, share that with me, or even if you've got a link, you can stick it in like the Q&A box so the audience can benefit from it as well. If you happen to have it, if you don't, that's okay. But what's fascinating about that is, for you guys in the audience, you know that the idea behind operational risk means that the organization itself, in theory, it shouldn't just be an IT issue anymore. It's become a business issue. It's something where the business should see the need to have DR plans in place because of, let's say, even if we just take things like cyber attack, which is about number 5 or 6 in this list over here on the right, but let's say a ransomware attack. That's a reality today. And in some cases, depending on if you look at a lot of cybersecurity issues, which I do, look at a lot of the trends, I write and speak about it quite a bit. I think that alone is a when and not an if. You're going to be attacked at some point successfully, and it's going to have a major impact on your operations. And so from that perspective, back to you, Travis, I'm sort of thinking it's kind of shocking to hear that, that a really material portion of organizations don't have any kind of plans. And because this shouldn't be just do we have a way to back it up? We have a way to recover it. Instead, it should be actually an integrated part of operations. If you're going to build a new system, you have a way to recover it as well. So I'm kind of wondering, Travis, for those that don't have a plan, any insight into the primary reason why they don't? Is it time, not enough staffing, just focus, support from executives? What have you been seeing?
Yeah, you're hitting it right on the head, and it's like anything else. It definitely comes down to time, because you're usually talking with a DR plan, potential multiple departments or resources, people getting together to develop all of the elements of what makes an effective business continuity plan or a disaster recovery plan. And then also it is also, besides time, it is just competing priorities. Disaster isn't what's happening right now, most of the time. So a plan is a very proactive thing to do. And yeah, you may, like you mentioned, they may think, well, we have backups or replicas of our environment, and that maybe it just kind of stops there in their mind, when really that's just the beginning of developing that DR strategy. And so to actually have that and leverage that along with other competing business priorities or other fires and emergencies that tend to pop up, I think that's where the problem is.
Yeah, it just seems to be, I think you hit it on the head. It's just a matter of priority. It's really what it comes down to for most organizations that still see DR as kind of a, let's call it an insurance policy, just like backups, so to speak. Until the organization is specifically, from top down, sees DR as something that is critical and is a necessary part of operations. Again, as you spin up some new environments, spin up new applications, move stuff to the cloud, you need to also incorporate as part of that process also having DR plans. I don't think we're going to see much difference here. So maybe what we can do is we can talk a little bit about how to have an effective DR plan. And the first aspect here for you guys in the audience is you definitely have to have executive buy-in. And you've kind of already heard me kind of say this. I want to beat a dead horse, but that's what's going to make this successful. So I'm assuming that most of you, as a matter of fact, if you want to kind of, complain a little bit and we can commiserate together, if having executive buy-in is a challenge for you, why don't you stick that in the Q&A box and just tell us that that's one of the challenges that you're having. And if there's some other challenges you're having, stick that in there as well. I just love to hear that from you to kind of help tailor the conversation a little bit as we're talking about maybe how to overcome some of those things. So if you have those, put those in the Q&A box. We'd love to hear from you. But the first part of making it effective is you absolutely have to have an executive buy-in at the highest level, because you are going to be coming back as part of the planning. You're going to be coming back saying, this is what we need to be able to do in order to achieve a proper disaster recovery, and this is what we can accomplish today, and here in the middle is the gap that exists. In order to, we want to achieve the recovery goals, we have to address the gap. That's going to require time, budget, resources, external expertise, whatever the case is. And that's obviously really tough to do. If you don't already have executive buy-in, and if you were to do that, all they're going to hear is, I need more dollars. They're not going to hear a reason why, or a valid reason why, maybe I should say, even though it is. They're going, I don't buy into this. I don't even know why you're even asking me. Just deal with what we have. Just make it work. And you're like, you can't make it work. That's not how that happens. Okay, so I'm with you. So you got to have executive buy-in. It's got to be a team effort. There are a number of people. You're going to have a DR coordinator. You're going to have people that are going to be providing contextual details around specific applications and workloads. You need to go to department heads, line of business owners, application owners. It's a whole team effort to make sure that everyone involved is ensuring that the plan that is put in place is actually going to work and be viable and put the organization back into a state of operation. And then you need some expertise from kind of two perspectives. The first one being internal. You need some institutional expertise. You guys should have that. You're the ones that know this system has to talk to that system. We always back those two up, and they're over here. We have a co-location over there for those, but these other systems of it, you know all that stuff, just the real institutional stuff of how your environment works. And of course, some of the stuff that is common to everybody, like if you have a Windows server and you have Active Directory, and those are things that aren't entirely institutional. That's something that's sort of broad-stroked, but definitely that institutional stuff, you have that. The other side of this is the recovery expertise, which you might not have, which might be one of the reasons you're on the call today. The idea behind this is you might need, as you're trying to plan a disaster recovery and you're trying to test it out and so on, you might need to go to an outside partner to get some assistance, somebody that's done this, tens, hundreds, thousands of times, hopefully hundreds and thousands, not tens, but you know what I'm saying, multiple times. That's what they do for a living. So that way, because we know in the end it's a lot more effort than just saying, let's recover all of the systems and turn everything back on. It doesn't work that easily. It can in some environments that are very simple, but in more complex environments, it's nowhere near that simple. So definitely having some recovery expertise, whether you have it internally or leveraging an outside partner, is important. And then also, if you've already maybe get this a little bit from some of the stuff I've said earlier today, recovery should be something that is just part of operations. So you can see here I put it should be thinking about this being as an ongoing effort. This is literally every day, every week. It's not like once a month, every quarter, or once a year. It's not one time per whatever frequency you want to use. The idea of making sure that you have an effective DR plan and you're doing DR testing and so on means that this is part of operations. This is something that we do. We verify backups. We make sure that we can recover. We do testing of recovery. And on a continual basis, not every day, not every minute, but it's continually being done. So Travis, of all the stuff that I've sort of listed here on the screen, which do you think is maybe most important and why?
Yeah, those are all really great and valid points. If I did have to pick one that I would consider probably most important, it's probably the last one, with thinking ongoing and not one time, just because it is, if you think of the DR plan as a document, it would be a living, breathing document. It needs to be, just because of how quickly, with today business, let alone technology, changes. We add new services and systems, or we upgrade them, we change them, we replace them. And if a disaster event happens and your DR plan was crafted a couple years ago, or even maybe sooner than that, but with outdated information, that's basically useless, especially considering that a DR plan is usually a big work effort to get in place in the first place. So you don't want to waste that by kind of just creating it and then sticking it on a shelf and just waiting for the disaster event to occur, and then that's when you refer to it. It does need to be an ongoing, always updated. People are aware of what's in there and who has certain responsibilities, and all that's clear, so that you're ready when it comes to a disaster event, as opposed to you're caught off guard by maybe even thinking you had a plan and finding out that plan is invalid.
I like the thinking about, you made a plan, you put it on a shelf, and then things change and you wait a year. Because the environment, as you guys in the audience know, your environment is constantly in a state of flux. I mean, sure, it's the same applications, the same systems, but the data is in flux. In some cases, the versions are changing. And in a lot of cases, I think we tend as IT folks to kind of go, well, in theory, it should be fine. Because that's still talking to, that system A is talking to system B, and if I'm backing them both up and I restore them both again, it should be just okay. And that might actually be 100% true, that system A and system B, even though you've upgraded them since the last time you did some kind of DR plan, that they should actually still just recover and be fine. That might be true, but you don't know that. And that's the idea that I think Travis is kind of hinting at a little bit of. You don't just build the plan and stick it on a shelf and you wait a year and go, I don't know, is it still up to date or not? As changes exist in the environment, the DR plan has to be changed as well. You agree, Travis?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Anything that I missed from this list to kind of make an effective DR plan that you've experienced with your customers?
I don't think so. A team effort is kind of what I was thinking as kind of a close second for most important, just because what I do see as a common mistake, I'll call it for lack of a better word, is usually a DR plan tends to fall maybe on like, we'll just say like the infrastructure or IT resources more often than not. And so they might be thinking about, okay, these systems are the most important, and they could easily miss some other important systems to the business, like maybe the payroll system or something like that, that of course are critical and important and need to be recovered and need to be a part of that plan. And so just determining and dictating those priorities really is a team effort, like you spoke to.
Agreed entirely. So let's do this. Let's talk a little bit about what the process looks like to build a plan. Now, this is kind of a really high-level version for you guys in the audience. It is a lot of detail. In fact, I've written a couple of ebooks, both on building DR plan and doing some DR testing for offsite data sync, and they're very long. So this is definitely going to be the 20,000-foot view of the process to build a plan. So don't think you're going to walk away after an hour and go, I got it, Nick. I can definitely start right now. I'm going to jump and get going on that. You definitely need a lot more detail than this. But at a high level, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to really understand the risks that exist in the environment. Now, in order to do this, generally speaking, there are two parts to understanding your risk. You've got to first do what's called a business impact analysis. And that is where you're going through the business and you're figuring out what are the workloads we have, what are the applications we have, what would it look like if those were to go down, all those kind of things. Just basically, it's all the aspects of trying to determine what's critical, what has priority, putting things in some kind of prioritization order or criticality order or something along those lines, and you're doing an analysis of what would be the impact of any kind of loss in general. We're not getting to losses or specific disasters yet. Just looking at the different parts of the business as they're operating, and if that part of the operation was missing, in this case we're really thinking about technology, so we're talking about systems and data and so on, but if that was to go down, how would that impact the organization? Then you have this list of things that are really important to the business. The second part of understanding your risk is then doing a risk assessment, which is to then look at the various types of, what we could call them disasters, for lack of a better term, and to me a disaster could be everything from the things that we think of as disasters, like a natural disaster, like it's a hurricane. Like I live in Florida, I have hurricanes. We just had one, Dorian, that came by. We missed it by a hair, and thankfully. But you think of something on that end all the way down to like somebody deleted a user account in Active Directory. So when I say disaster, again, air quotes here in my office, it's anything in between those two. Just somebody fat fingers something and deletes it, all the way up to we've got an entire wipeout and a loss of an entire operation. And you look at each one of those kinds of risks to the organization and you determine how likely is that risk, and then you apply that to those different workloads, the different parts and aspects of the operation that you determined in the business impact analysis, and put them together and say, okay, what is it we have to worry about? Like, for example, if you're in Florida, you might say having a hurricane 3 months of the year, very real risk. What happens if we have a hurricane and it wipes out all over this entire location in Fort Lauderdale? Then what do we do? And so that's the idea of those two things together. So you got to understand your risks that way. Once you've done that, now you understand both what you have to protect via the business impact analysis and from what do you need to protect it, and that's through the risk assessment. Now, second is going to be thinking about what has to be part of your plan. Now, there's a long list of stuff, and it's impossible in the time frame that we have today to go through all of these things. But talk about what has to be part of the plan. If you look through this list here, all these are various aspects of a DR plan. Some things that I'll just kind of quickly touch on. Things like roles and responsibility. You have to define who's going to do what. It's really important to do that and assign people responsibilities and have it be documented in the plan so they do understand what they're expected to be doing as part of this plan. Things like the recovery requirements that exist on a per workload basis. any training necessary, the actual procedures for recovery, and then we're going to talk about testing. Testing is going to be so critical. We got an entire little bit of discussion about it and so on. But then also fail over is usually part of the recovery process. You should also have fail back and have a procedure for that. For some organizations, they just decide we're going to figure that out when we get to it. That's fine. At least you have it documented. At least everyone knows that's the process we're going through, or it's documented how you're going to do that, as well as having, and this last one is kind of critical, an update protocol for the entire plan. Like how often do we review it? Who makes changes? Who approves the changes? What kind of changes do we need to have documented in here? Because as the business and the organization's technology gets changed, let's say, for example, you flip from having on-premises Exchange to Office 365's based Exchange Online, what you need to back up is different now. How you're going to recover it is going to be different now. And how often should you be updating this whole thing and make sure that this plan incorporates, let's say, that shift in the way that the business operates. And then the last step here, that should be a number 3, apologies here, should be to address gaps. And that is you're going to find gaps that exist. I mentioned those a couple slides ago. You're going to have to go back to your executives that are buying into this program and say, okay, we've got this plan outlined. Here's everything that we need to be doing in order to meet the objectives, the recovery objectives we have as a business. Here's what we can accomplish. Here are the gaps. We're going to have to address those. So, Travis, I've done enough talking on this slide, but I definitely want to get your take on this. And there's obviously a lot that goes into a plan here. So what are some of the parts that you'd want to stress to customers in general and to our audience that they definitely need to be part of the plan?
Yeah, really there's 3 parts that I tend to focus in on. The first is really determining what are the critical systems, and what pieces and things, how important are they, what things need to be considered, kind of you're talking about that business impact analysis. So really defining that, and that's usually something that is internal, that your team, your business can dictate. Obviously, consultants can help, but a lot of that really does come down to your business needs and what's critical and, what's being down for an hour versus being down for a day. How does that impact your business versus another business? Those could be wildly different things that go into the plan. Another part that I stress is testing. So you have on there testing the plan. So anything is only as good as you test it, whether that's backups, whether that's replication, whether that's the plan in its entirety, any plan, anything that you develop and document is only as good as you test it. And so if you don't test it and you go to use it, it may not actually be any good, turns out, and so that's the concern there, is to test it so that you know that when you call upon certain systems or a plan or whatever, that it's going to function the way that you expect and have kind of shaped everything around that. The third and kind of final piece that I stressed is something you have on there, which is the failback procedure. So really closing that loop, because it is a big hurdle to be up and running, because obviously being down is a major concern and factor. So it is no small thing to have a plan and actually get up and running again. But that's not the final piece. Just because you're up and running again doesn't mean you're back to normal. And so getting back to normal, getting back to kind of the status quo of business function is also important. So whether that's, you fail over into a colo, let's say, so you're up and running, that's great. You can continue your business, but you do need to consider failing back. Maybe that's, your site needs to be totally rebuilt, brick and mortar and everything, or you need to order new hardware or whatever it might be. Then there is that consideration of failing back those resources, being back to normal. And maybe that's a small thing, just depending on what the disaster is. So maybe getting back to normal and closing that failback part of the loop is not a big work effort, but it is, just depending on what you've planned for, what you're prepared for, and what systems you're leveraging and things you have in place to kind of take care of that you are up and running in the event of a disaster. So it's easy to overlook just the kind of that final piece of failing back, getting back to normal, everything is as it was pre-disaster event.
It's interesting. You got me thinking about with the failbacks. One of the other things that isn't necessarily a separate part of the plan, but definitely something that has to be part of the recovery procedure and the failover and that sort of thing, is the idea around user connectivity. Generally speaking, when we think about DR plans, we're always focused on the servers and the data and the applications and the connectivity and the protocols and the network, and no one's thinking about what happens if I lose like all my endpoints, all my workstations are gone, or everyone has to work from home because the office is, you mentioned that great example, that the office may be entirely wiped out and you have to replace everything kind of a thing. How do you get users connected? So as part of this DR plan, you guys have to be thinking about how do we test that, how do we plan for that, how do we ensure that happens, and then with the failover and the failback, what changes have to be made? Like, for example, do we need to make, like a proxy server change on every endpoint, or do I have to make a DNS change on every endpoint, or whatever the case is? So those kind of things have to kind of be included here. Travis, for those that have a plan, your customers that actually have a plan, what parts do you find customers doing sort of all the things that we've got listed here or some other aspect, but I think this is sort of comprehensive to a degree. What parts of the plan do you find customers doing sort of less than an adequate job, which of course impacts the effectiveness of the overall plan?
That's a great question. And probably the thing I find more often than not, and it's a drum we've kind of beat a little bit, is testing. A lot of customers, they want to test once a year, and they really don't, because it is a big work effort to kind of not, along with your kind of daily business function and uses and all those things, to test. And sometimes your test is a small test, which is still good. It's still good to test at all. Part of your systems, but too much that you can simulate real world is also a good thing, but obviously that's a big ask and somewhat maybe even not impossible, but near it for some people to replicate or to kind of simulate or to test. And so sometimes they just don't do it at all, or just they try to, and then other competing priorities again come in, and it prevents them from really doing what they want to or even need to be doing.
Good answer, and I like that a lot. Let's talk a little bit about testing. You and I both kind of harped on that quite a bit throughout today. And so maybe we talk a little bit about sort of how that is critical. For you guys in the audience, I'm going to guess most of you kind of fit into those percentages that Travis, what was the percentage of people that didn't do testing that you mentioned, that even if they had a plan, they still didn't do testing? What was it?
Yeah, it was still similar to just that companies don't have a plan at all, which was 75%.
About 75%. So I'm going to guess that you guys in the audience that testing is one of the things that you can't get to. The thing to keep in mind here is that even if you have a plan, even with a recovery plan, this statement is true. Recovery isn't a given. You're not guaranteed recovery, right? If you don't test at all, everything you've got written down in your plan is, I'm doing air quotes, in theory. It really is in theory, even though it's probably a very good educated guess. Like we all know for the most part, you should be able just to go and click on a backup job and say restore and put it over to here, and the software's going to work. Everything should be fine, right? I mean, again, but it's still in theory because you don't know, especially if you're not doing things like, let's say, validating backups every time that you're having a backup created, things like that. There are certain things you can do to make sure that you increase the chances. And as I've talked about a little bit before, and Travis has mentioned as well, you have plenty of changes that go on in your in the network. You've got things like environmental changes. Again, if you maybe switch from being on premises to a hybrid cloud environment, so the environment might be a little different, or you might have another office that opens up with its own servers and that kind of thing. The technologies that you utilize, whether it's the applications, whether you're utilizing virtualization, maybe you switch vendors, you start using containers instead. I mean, the technology utilized can be changed even from the time a plan is written to when it needs to be executed. The dependencies can change depending on what's necessary. Like there's some very simple ones that I love to use because everybody sort of gets these, but like Exchange as an example requires Active Directory, and it relies on DNS in order to function. So there are those dependencies. You may have other applications, especially ones that are in-house applications, where there are dependencies, and those dependencies can change as well. The objectives of the organization. We talk about usually recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives. The RTOs, recovery time objectives, meaning if you're not familiar with the terms, just to level set everyone and make sure everyone's on the same page. That's basically the amount of time that you have to recover within. So if your recovery time objective is 15 minutes, you're trying to get a system up and running in 15 minutes. Your recovery point objective, your RPO, is basically how much data can be lost. So if we want to have our recovery point be, let's say, 10 minutes ago, then the idea is within 15 minutes from now, we want to recover to 10 minutes ago. That's my two objectives. Those objectives change. They change because of, actually, I'll click one more time here, because of the expectations put upon businesses. And those expectations that get put on businesses dictate what expectation the business has on you to deliver during a recovery scenario. And so lots of continual changes going on here. And so the idea here is that you have to test. It has to be a part of the process. Now, I know it's super easy for me to say that. You're like going, Nick, that's great. I have to test. It's wonderful. How do I get the money to test? Or what kind of testing am I supposed to do? Or how are we supposed to get approval for this? I get it. I know it's not that easy. It's a lot easier for me to say than for you to do. I totally feel you. But it is still necessary. And figuring that part out is going to be, for some of you it might be a challenge, but it's still a necessary challenge to walk through. Some organizations choose to do tabletop walkthroughs, meaning we literally sit down at a table and we walk through the plan, and we're going through the in theory, and we allow everyone to kind of poke holes in it. That's a whole lot better than just writing out, we're going to select a backup set for the Exchange box and the Active Directory server, in keeping with my last example, and we're going to hit restore. Yeah, that's great. Let's sit down and talk about it for a minute. And then someone will say, well, what happens if every server doesn't come up? And we've got 3 different Exchange boxes, each one having a different set of services. And what happens if we don't get all of the FSMO roles and Active Directory? You start having these technical discussions. So there's still some value, in doing tabletop walkthroughs. But it's not as good as the other option here, which is doing recovery simulations. You want to do either a partial or a full recovery simulation. Partial would be, I'm going to pick a couple of servers or a particular application, and I'm going to try to recover it. And if you're recovering, let's say, up into the cloud and utilizing virtualization, whether it's a P2V scenario or it's just you're replicating virtualized servers up, or you're simply recovering into the cloud, whatever the case is, you do simulations and you perform it. You actually do failover and you try to see if that works. Now, failover is probably in a limited capacity, like you have a given endpoint that is a workstation that will then be reconfigured to test out, do I have connectivity to the failed over system up in the cloud, and then you can try fail back and that kind of thing. So there's a couple different ways to do this. Basically, there's sort of 3. There's the partial simulation, the full simulation, and then the tabletop walkthrough. Travis, the data that I've seen, I had shown that slide previously with that chart that was from the Disaster Recovery Journal. They've got a report that says basically almost every org does some kind of testing. If they have a DR plan, and DR planning is important to them, they have some kind of testing in place. What's your thought on the type of testing that is necessary really to see this be successful?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's really going to vary from business to business and use case to use case. I'd say partial is at least a good starting place, like you mentioned. I mean, obviously the tabletop and kind of walk through it in theory, like you said, is better than nothing, but at least getting some kind of real world, action out there is great to see, because that can maybe show you some things that you didn't really plan or prepare for. If you can simulate fully, then that's absolutely going to be best. But again, that may not even be feasible, just depending on the type of business organization or hardware limitations or any number of things that they just maybe can't work with. But at least a partial is the great kind of median between the two.
No, I totally agree here. I think you don't want to give yourself a false sense of security from a tabletop walkthrough that it's going to work. And at the same time, you guys in the audience totally feel and understand and recognize that when we're sitting there going, you should do a recovery simulation, that's a lot of work. I mean, literally you're recovering an entire environment in some cases if you're going to try and go full board. But it's still a necessary part of the DR planning process, because you've got to test what you're planning. You don't just jump in the car and start driving and hope that you get there. You don't want to do it that way. You really want to try and make sure that this is going to recover properly. It's going to work the way you think it's going to work, and so on. So as close as you can get to recovery simulations, as close as you can get to a full recovery simulation, which I love that you said it may not be feasible, Travis, because I think that I 100% agree. I was nodding over here on my end, because some of you are going, it's way too complex. I've got DevOps, and I've got production, and I've got pre-production. No way, not going to happen. I get it, but then at least do something. At least of the critical workloads, the ones you absolutely have to have, do some kind of recovery simulation of those environments. Travis, what do you think about testing frequency? How often do you think that testing, whether it's tabletop, recovery simulation, whatever, how frequent do you think testing should be?
I kind of see the average of once a year, which seems to be okay. I would maybe lean a little bit more toward if possible, twice a year. Some people obviously do like monthly, and that's kudos to them. That's very aggressive. But once a year, I'd say, is sufficient. And I guess probably a lot of that seems to stem from compliance. There might be some different ones, but it seems like a lot of the compliance that I see out there seems to dictate testing at least once a year type intervals.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned compliance, because for those of you in the audience, if you got laws like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations over in the European Union, and you've got other ones that are coming here stateside, like the California Consumer Privacy Act that comes out in January of next year. They're starting to put in verbiage that doesn't exactly, to Travis's point, doesn't say like this is how frequent you have to test recovery, but they do talk about the fact that you have to be able to recover and put the environment back in place in a way that, one, is secure, and two, that it's available, especially with the aspects of like the ability to request to be forgotten, which is sort of a rule that they started with GDPR, and it's an interesting one. It's where their personal data, if it's not in use by an organization, like for doing business, you can request that they delete you, and it has to be deleted. And so being able to have the system, let's say, that helps with dealing with those kinds of requests has to be up and running. So the compliance does kind of come in play here from a DR perspective. Really important there. Let's talk lastly about utilizing expertise to prepare. And I mentioned early on for you guys in the audience about having expertise, both institutional, and you guys meet that need yourself. But if you think about, as we've covered a lot of different aspects of DR plans, there's lots of opportunities there where you're going to go, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do there. I mean, again, the basic premise of like what your recovery process should be, you probably have. But knowing that everything is going to be appropriately spelled out, planned out, and will execute properly, you may not have. There's a couple of them that I've got here. Things like some of the dependencies that you might have, especially if you're thinking about recovering into a virtual environment, something that you don't control. You may have some odd dependencies, especially if you're only, let's say, recovering one part of your environment up into the cloud, and there's dependencies down on-prem. You might want to have, at least, if nothing else, from a planning perspective, someone that has DR expertise coming in saying, hey, have you thought about this? And they talk about, something they've already seen. Travis is a perfect example. He's seen 1 million DRs, DR executions, and done some planning with customers, and he hasn't done 1 million. You know what I meant. Figuratively, not literally. But yeah, he's done a bunch of them, and he's seen things, and that's actually kind of good from that perspective. Staffing is another one where you just don't have the staffing in order to execute this on the other end. When you actually have to do the plan and make it happen, you may not have the team enough to get it done. The planning itself and building the plan, what's supposed to be in the plan, what should it look like, that kind of thing can require some as well. Expertise on the infrastructure necessary is a real challenge. Sometimes organizations say, no, I got that. I'm going to a public cloud vendor. I have infrastructure. Here's the challenge. Typically with a public cloud vendor, one thing I do want to forewarn you, I'm not saying they're bad, but I want you to be cognizant of this so that if you go and select a public cloud vendor, you are thinking in these terms. You have very specific hardware requirements for workloads, servers, that kind of thing. And when you're going to go purchase cloud-based infrastructure, you typically aren't buying like, I need a quad-core processor and I need 4 gigs of RAM. It's not like you're going to a store and you're checking boxes off or something and you're buying the thing you need. You're buying tiers of plans, and you're getting a certain amount of hardware. And in some cases, there might be cost issues where you go, what I really need is I need the best plan, but all I can really afford is the better plan, and the better plan doesn't quite have all the infrastructure I need, so what am I going to have to sacrifice? Am I sacrificing performance? Am I not putting as many services up in there or applications or workloads up in there? You have to think about that and just be aware of that. So having some expertise on the cloud side would be helpful there. Recovery itself, just the act of performing a recovery, specifically around things like not so much the restoring, I'm using a very specific word there, restoring of a backup set. That's not what I mean by recovery. I'm thinking more about orchestration, automation, making sure that things come up exactly the way that you're planning, in exactly the order you're planning, at exactly the time that you're planning, and that kind of expertise in doing orchestration as part of recovery, that's something that you may not have any experience doing whatsoever. And then the last one here, and Travis touched on this, and I have as well, I've mentioned it, fail back. It's something that we just tend to see in IT. We never plan that. We're always planning okay, I'm going to recover to the cloud, and then everything will be fine, or whatever the plan is. That was a high-level 100,000-foot plan, but you have something with far more detail, but no one ever says, and a week later, we're going to fail back, and here's the process. Nobody seems to have that, and being able to figure out what that's supposed to look like may require some expertise, and that's why you may want to think about having a DR partner. Now, Travis, where do you end up finding customers missing the most expertise in this process?
Yeah, I'd say definitely to some degree, various pieces of that. But the ones that jump out to me are staffing and planning for sure, because just having enough people and resources. How many companies have someone that wears multiple hats? So having people that really are the experts in certain elements and pieces that go into disaster recovery, and having enough people to do the work that's required, that's absolutely part of it. But also planning, because it can be tough, like you're saying, to answer those questions. What do we do? When do we do it? How do we do it? Especially if you get maybe a lot of department heads in the room and they all have vested interest in pieces of the systems or the business, then they're probably coming with competing priorities of, then everything's critical, well, then nothing's critical. And so really having the expertise around planning around parts of the business, parts of the systems, all those pieces in play, whether that's, personnel safety all the way to, some lowly file server that, could come up dead last or something. I mean, there's so many things to consider that really thinking through the plan and having the expertise to dictate what falls in what place in priority. And the last would be really, like you've mentioned and I've mentioned, is that failback, because how often do companies, how have they experienced a disaster? That's part of the problem is, we don't experience it ourselves often. We see it, we read about it, but, internally, our company probably hasn't seen a disaster, let alone also, even if we've hired from outside and all these other people, the company they work with probably didn't, experience a disaster. So then on top of that, let alone did they actually test and experience and have some working knowledge of the failback, the back to normal process.
So I'm wondering, what are some of the other benefits maybe that I didn't have listed kind of up here, if you will, the audience should consider about using a DR partner?
Yeah, that's a good question. So with a DR partner, such as like the company I work for, Offsite Data Sync, we see a lot of disasters. We do and work with, we consider ourselves DR experts. So we do a lot leveraging the Veeam product, but we do a lot with, customers declaring disasters, spinning up from backups or failing over replicas back down into their own environment or into our environment, walking them through from step one, stage one, the disaster has happened, to getting them all the way back to failed back and normal. So we've seen that enough times with other customers that are across the globe, other parts of the country, however you want to think about it. So when it comes to you and your business, your area, maybe that's never happened to anyone that you maybe meet in some sort of user group or something, and no one's really ever experienced it. So with a partner that has a broader reach and broader experience like that, and has done it enough times and consistently to where you really gain that working knowledge and those best practices that are valuable. And so people can tap into that with, working with a trusted and valued partner. And then, and with that is just other services that we offer. And, maybe some DR partners don't, which is which is DR testing, which is plans, which is developing and working through those plans and helping customers develop them and test them regularly and, really validate and get to a good place with their disaster recovery, component of their business.
Great answers here. So we got about 13 minutes left. I know that you got a couple of slides you want to cover. So why don't you go ahead and I'll kind of pass things over to you to take control and cover your slides. And then for you guys in the audience, if you have any questions about anything we've talked about thus far or anything that Travis is going to cover about offsite data sync, stick those in the Q&A box. We would love to make sure we have a chance to ask them, answer them. And so with that, Travis, go ahead and take things over. It's all yours.
Yeah, thanks. So part of that, with considering a DR partner and choosing the right provider is to consider where is your data stored. So is it stored like it needs to be for compliance reasons in a certain location, or is it, if you're a U.S.-based, you need to stay U.S.-based, is the data stored here? Is it stored overseas? Is it stored in a secure facility, or is it stored at, some mom and pop type location where, it's not secure? Someone could just walk in and look, and see and touch the devices, so to speak, all the storage and things. Is it basically someone's basement, for lack of a better analogy there as far as the low end, or is it someone that takes data security and data sensitivity seriously? So like offsite data sync, primarily we partner with the Switch SuperNAP data center facilities, which are the only Tier 4 gold carrier neutral commercially available data center facility in the U.S. And so we've chosen to partner with them for those reasons, so that the data is stored securely, and that's a consideration that we don't have to be concerned about and the customer doesn't have to be concerned about, because we know that that part of choosing the right provider is taken care of. And then how is your data backed up really speaks to, what are you doing as far as like 3-2-1, which is, 3 copies of your data, 2 types of medium, and then 1 being offsite. So really that comes down to, are you just kind of saying, yep, I have a backup and we're good, or is it backed up in ways that really you would consider yourself well protected and all things considered and well-rounded in scope and in light of a disaster recovery plan? And then how quickly can the data be restored? So is it, is the provider using really cheap and slow storage? And if you needed to restore from that backup, or if you needed to fail over to your replica, then how slow is that going to be? How long is that going to take, or how painful is that going to be to operate? So there's a lot of considerations as to the environment and into what a provider is leveraging, so that really are you, when you have those events, is the DR event now compounded and made worse because a provider is using certain types of hardware or functionality or things? So then that comes to why offsite data sync, and there's a lot of things on this slide, but really a couple that I want to point out. One is the secure and compliant, as I mentioned. So with especially the Switch SuperNAP facilities meets just about any and all compliance needs, FedRAMP, ITAR, there's a bunch, and then experienced. So one of the things about experience that I've already kind of mentioned about just considering DR partner in general is how often, and we get this, and I've been asked this on pre-sales calls, is when was the last time you had a customer experience a disaster, and what was that like? And depending on the situation or different things, we'll share whatever we can. But really, it's not uncommon that to some degree, at least monthly, if not sometimes weekly, just depending on the scale and scope of a disaster, isn't being declared, isn't being initiated, and that we're being involved in working with that customer. And really, another thing is just that partnership. So another thing on this slide here is credentialed professionals. So you want to know that you're working with experts. You're working with the best of the best. You're working with someone that's going to work with you, because there are so many things that need to take place. There's kind of so many fires to put out, so to speak, during a disaster. So you want to know that you're working with people that are going to be there with you. They're going to be able to answer your questions. They're going to be able to work with you through the entire thing, kind of hold your hand through and kind of take some of that burden away when it comes to, if you needed to fail over and now you maybe failed over into our environment, that we've worked with you through that. We've helped you through that, so that's kind of one less thing for you to consider. And that's really all I have.
Very good. Well done, Travis. I'm not seeing any questions in here in the Q&A box. If you guys have any, we would love to make sure we have an opportunity to answer those. If you have them, we'll wait just a moment here. But while we're waiting for any other questions to come in, you actually can see over here on the upper left-hand corner of your screen here a quick survey that some of you have already started answering here, which is basically what would you like your next webinar to be on. So make sure that you go ahead and populate that as well. And it looks like, as I'm sort of done here, it looks like we have no more questions here, so I don't mind letting class out early, as it were. But Travis, any final thoughts just to kind of summarize maybe one of the most important things you want people to walk away with from today's webcast?
Yeah, to some degree and as much as possible, seeing that 75% number kind of come down. So anyone that's participating, do what you can to make sure that your organization is developing a plan and then also testing that plan.
Yeah, well done, well said. I'm going to add to that something even simpler than that, and it's just 2 words: do something. Don't do nothing, do something. At least go down this path and try and see if you can build some kind of plan. Don't just walk away without a plan. So with that, Travis, thanks for a great conversation today. I really appreciated the ability to go back and forth a little bit and discuss this topic.
Yeah, my pleasure. Absolutely.
It was a good time we had. So those of you guys in the audience, thanks for your attention today. And this concludes today's webcast, and we'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks a lot for your attention.